Thanks for the introduction, Ryan, and happy to be here and be fondled in front of you. Thanks, Beth. So today I'm going to talk to you about my evolving understanding and approach to the treatment of COVID-19 spike protein-induced disease. What that really describes is the syndromes that you've heard of, which is long COVID, and then post-vaccine injury syndrome. This is, I'm going to go into the slide in a second. This is how I diagnose these syndromes, but I want to say a couple of things first. The epidemiology of these syndromes is a little bit unclear, but we have two really shocking sources of data. One is from a database called vSafe, which the CDC created to follow and track patients who receive these injections. It's a database of 10 million people. They had an app downloaded to their phone. They were instructed to upload any issues, symptoms. The symptoms were actually discrete. You couldn't actually free text anything in, so they kind of had predetermined what you were allowed to report. But you could report whether you had to seek medical care. And just to give you an idea of just another data point for just how much trouble we're in as a society, Ryan talked about that slide that public health is about education, prevention. That is definitely part of it. Part of that education prevention is collecting data, sharing data with society so we can better protect ourselves. And with this vSafe data, they were not sharing it. I mean, that is literally their core mission, is to gather, collect data, and disseminate it. And they would not share it. And Del Bigtree's organization, ICANN, which is the Informed Consent Action Network, with their amazing lawyer, Aaron Siri, they sued. They did a FOIA request, and they got a judge to order that the CDC release this data. And what was in the data, it was pretty clear why they were hiding it. Because in that data, it shows that 7.8% of everybody who received this vaccine reported requiring medical care as a result. Think about that for a second. I mean, you'd have to be a physician to know what that means, but for me, there's no treatment I've ever delivered to anyone where as a direct result of that treatment, someone would require seeking medical care from being hurt by that treatment. And then it's even more appalling when you consider what that treatment is. That's a treatment delivered to generally healthy people who are not actively sick with an illness. So you're giving them something that's supposed to make them protect their health, and 7.8% of them, you're sending them to the doctor. I mean, there's really nothing more absurd about that. And that data is actually mirrored from a large Veterans Administration database, which showed a similar percent. It was about 7.5 or 8% of veterans reported needing medical care as a result. So these are the most toxic medical interventions that have ever been deployed, let alone globally in this mass global vaccination campaign. So they really do make you sick. I'll make a quick comment and not a fun comment, but my practice, I see patients with these syndromes. I don't see dead people. Many people die before they can come to my practice. I treat the chronically ill, not these acute complications. And so when I talk about these syndromes, I'll just tell you my understanding of what happens with COVID and the vaccines is that I kind of, differentiate what happens afterwards between, let's say, for instance, post-vaccine complications and post-vaccine syndrome. So what's the difference? A complication for me is a single organ dysfunction or a single organ problem. So it might be a myocarditis, some inflammation of the heart muscle or the lining around the heart, which is pericarditis, a stroke, loss of vision, hearing, ringing in the ears. Those are kind of single problems that can happen, and they happen to a very, very high degree. I would say in my private practice, that's not what patients come to me for. When they suffer a complication, they usually stay within the system. I'm outside that system now, and they usually see system doctors. Those are rather kind of traditional complications. They don't really know why that was caused. They don't have good treatments for it, but generally that's who they deal with. So I don't see the complications. So what do I see? So I see these syndromes, and what I see is that patients report developing, as you can see from this slide, a constellation of symptoms, and it develops in temporal association to one of those events, so either the vaccine or COVID. And the most classic, so if you take vaccines, for instance, and myself and my partner, we've been in practice now with the dedicated mission to focus on figuring out how to treat this illness, because we saw that there's innumerable people suffering. And so the time sort of lines that we see, and we have probably seen 500-600 patients now, It's kind of like three pathways. So one, there's patients who get sick minutes to hours from the vaccine. A lot of that is an acute reaction, but when you take their histories, those who come to see me, this is many months later. In fact, almost everyone I've seen in the last year and a half has been already sick for 18 months by the time they get to me. It's pretty hard to find me on the internet because if you look me up, it's a whole bunch of nonsense. So you can't find my practice, and I think that's on purpose. But those that see me, they can relate it to starting that day, and then it continues, and then this whole constellation develops. And I'll tell you what those symptoms are in a second. Others, and this is the most common, it's usually within days to weeks, where suddenly they might have a little rough time around the vaccine, some aches, some fevers, some fatigue. They bounce back, and then things start to go sideways. And then the third cohort, which kind of confuses me, is I have a small cohort of patients where they did fine with the vaccine, and some months later, 3-4 months later, suddenly develop rather typical symptoms of this syndrome, or a rather narrow set of them. That's why they confuse me a little bit. And then with COVID, the general development of this post-COVID or long COVID syndrome is they recover from COVID generally well, and then they start to decline over the next days and weeks after recovery. So what is that constellation? So what I say is, I would say of those 500-600 patients that we've seen, I would say almost every single one of them had these three first symptoms. When I say almost everyone, when I see there's probably 5% of them that don't have the brain fog. So what are they presenting with? And what they're presenting with, which has been classically described, it does mimic a syndrome that has been described for decades, that the system has really failed to figure out or treat. Chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalitis, been described for actually 100 years, often associated with infections or other toxic exposures. And that's what this syndrome most resembles, with a whole bunch of idiosyncrasies that haven't really been described before. And so that syndrome is this development of this kind of inexorable refractory fatigue, and it can be quite severe. The patients just suddenly feel tired, really tired. They start taking naps. They just don't have energy. They can't start their day. They'll tell me it takes them hours to get out of bed. And that fatigue is associated with the most debilitating symptom, which is what we call post-exertional malaise. I don't think it's an aggressive enough term, but post-exertional malaise is when they do activities or any exertion, it falls out of my patients' mouths, but they'll use the terms, I have to pay for it, meaning they'll do something simple, and I'll give you some severe examples of patients in my practice, but for instance, one gentleman, he reports going to get the mail at his mailbox at the curb, leaving the house, walking to the mailbox, getting the mail, coming back in bed for 2 hours, absolutely demolished with fatigue, feels really crappy the rest of the day. And if it's not the fatigue that ramps up from that even limited exertion, it flares up a whole bunch of other symptoms that I'll tell you. And so these patients pay for these exertions. Probably the worst case is someone I saw recently who was actually a former Australian competitive swimmer. So you're talking about some of the most fittest women on earth. She's 28. She is so sick from the vaccine. She's been in a wheelchair for 2 years, not because her legs and arms don't work. She actually can move her legs and arms freely. She can't stand. Every time she stands, so much of her regulatory process, the neurological control of a lot of the circulation, the heartbeat, the blood pressure is completely destroyed that she feels like she's going to die when she stands up. So she's wheeled around in a wheelchair. I've just started to see her and treat her, and I'm hoping that we can get her to improve. But you get a sense of just how severe this is. This post-exertional malaise has a number of causes. But on the whole, I would say almost everyone who sees me kind of meets at least my definition. I'm not a disability assessment doctor, but they meet my definition of disability. And that disability data is some of the most worrisome. Not only the excess mortality, that would be the most worrisome because we're losing young people all over the world, but if you look at the work of Ed Dowd, anyone? Yeah? Hawaiian, lives on Maui, and I find his work unparalleled, and I find his the most unimpeachable because he is using government data that's open, available to the public, showing the temporal association with these massive explosions in death and disability amongst young people. And what nobody can explain, and Ed tries not to provide answers, but he puts it out there. Why did working age Americans, those who are employed, start landing on disability rolls at rates we've never seen in history, suddenly in 2021 going into 2022? You have millions now entering disability ranks and millions entering funeral homes. I mean, it's a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions, and yet everything's okay. It's safe and effective. That's the kind of society we're living in now. These are deep, dark secrets. They're kept secret, and we've been trying to bring it out, but we're up against forces of censorship and propaganda. But to go back to that disability, so they all have fatigue, post-exertional malaise, and like I said, almost everyone reports brain fog. So what is brain fog? It's a deficit in some sort of cognitive function, the most common of which, the most mildest of which, is patients will tell me that they have word-finding difficulties. At the worst, if that's all they have, some of my patients say it's awkward because they'll be at having a conversation with friends and then they're stuck in the middle of the sentence. They can't find the word that they're looking for next. Others will report that plus short-term memory. They forget where their keys are, what they did this morning, where whoever is or went. And then there's focus and concentration. They try to do their work, whether it be on a screen or otherwise. They do an hour or two and they just cannot focus anymore and they start to deteriorate. They have to stop. And I have some patients who really have they're holding on to work for a little bit of income and they're just begging their employers to go down to really reduced time and duty, an hour or two a day for some at most. And for some, I think they're doing too much, but they're terrified of losing benefits, of losing income. And then the worst is probably orientation. Sometimes they forget where they are, what day it is. And so they can get really sick neurologically and cognitively. And what's interesting about those deficits is they're not static as if someone had a stroke. They kind of are variable. They have good days and bad days. And especially with exertion, sometimes when they overexert those limits, the brain fog just sets in. So some of them really suffer cognitively if they try to do too much. It's really overtaxing the body. The body is so dysregulated and disordered that they can't actually support normal function. Okay, after those kind of what I call the big three, then there's a whole side list of symptoms they come with this constellation. In order of most frequent, probably the top two are tied, but generally they come to me with neuropathic symptoms, and the most common of which are sensory. So we have kind of two systems of nerves in our body, those that mediate sensations from the periphery to the brain, right? When you touch like a hot plate or touch anything, you want to have a good sense of touch and vibration and temperature. And all of those fibers that mediate it are inflamed and damaged. And so suddenly they're being triggered, and these patients are suffering kind of round-the-clock sensory input, burning, pins and needles, electric shock-like feelings, numbness, or sometimes just frank out the pain fibers being triggered. And they feel like they have lots of roving chest pains of all sorts of very colorful descriptions. And, I give these anecdotes, but she woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and she felt like she had been in the sun and she had a 3rd-degree sunburn all over her body. She was burning up. She had nothing but overwhelming feelings of her body on fire. Went to the ER. They think they gave her some pain meds. They couldn't really do anything for her. And she told me she spent 2 months in bed with rotating ice packs. Rotating ice packs because the pain was so severe. Luckily, a couple of the medicines that I used, she had been started on before she saw me. When I saw her for the first time, she was about a 6 out of 10 on a continuous pain scale around the clock from living at 10 out of 10. So you hear these just incredible stories of suffering. And so those neuropathies are really plaguing them, making life miserable. I mean, think about what it's like to go through a day where you have constant messages from your body which are noxious, distracting, cannot even make you laugh or concentrate or do activities, and you suffer. And the other thing that I'm going to sort of mention about this is what it's like to live in this current society, at this current time in history as a vaccine-injured person. You have an illness that doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. I'm the one talking about vaccine injury, and a small circle of colleagues and networks that I work with will treat this disease. The system calls everything long COVID. They've set up long COVID centers at academic medical centers all around the country, which are completely worthless. They're fake. You go there, there's numerous specialties, it's a multidisciplinary effort and insight, and they tell these patients to do the worst things. They tell them that they need light exercise. Absolute insanity. These patients are too sick for exercise. I love exercise. I think it's a harbinger and a foundation of health, but not until you're ready. And in fact, this makes them worse. They refer, they test, they do tons of imaging and blood tests. And that's the other tragedy of being vaccinated. So not only is it not recognized, for a time, if you talked about it, you were attacked, you were disliked by your doctors, by your family, by friends. We know of many instances. The most famous case was the professional mountain bike racer named Kyle Warner, whose mountain bike career was decimated. He had to retire temporarily as a professional athlete because he had a severe myocarditis, and he recorded a video of his experiences, which I think is appropriate. You want to let others know what happened to you to maybe warn them that this could happen to you. And he was roundly attacked and vilified as an anti-vaxxer. The world has gone mad. We've been whipped into a frenzy with unrelenting propaganda, demonization of the unvaccinated. And here's a guy who got vaccinated, and now he's being attacked because he's hurting others, because he's talking about how he was hurt. Logic disappeared 3 years ago, as far as I'm concerned. And so, I think those are important things to recognize. And then the third thing is that the lack of positive testing. Right? There is no really quantifiable or diagnosable way to make this diagnosis. It's what's called a clinical diagnosis. You make the diagnosis through history, through understanding their symptoms, the temporal associations, and that's why I say it's this constellation of symptoms, and it generally fits this pattern. It's not a hard diagnosis to make. Every patient I see will give me some variations of the same story. It's the same diagnosis. But the problem is when they go to system doctors and they relate this horrific plethora of symptoms, the doctor looks at all the tests, CT normal, MRI normal, blood tests, oh, that's a little abnormal, not sure what to do about that. And then they look at the patient who's absolutely miserable. For a long time, they wouldn't even entertain or discuss the fact that it was related to the vaccine. They knew what wasn't causing it. That's all they knew, is that it wasn't the vaccine. They didn't know what it was, they just knew it wasn't the vaccine. And that's not really a joke. It's over and over and over again. Doctors absolutely dismiss the idea that the vaccine could be the root cause of their problem. So think about what that is. You're in with unrelenting symptoms, you're ill, you're disabled, you're looking for help. They did their part. They took the vaccine, believing some of those psychological manipulations that they did to us, right? Do it for your grandmother, do it for your colleagues, You're hurting people if you don't get vaccine. And a lot of people did it because they thought it was the right thing to do, because they were told by trusted authorities that this was the right thing to do. And then they did it, and they get hurt, and now they're essentially gaslit and abandoned. I can't think of anything worse to do to a human. And that's what I see in the histories of my patients every single day. And so, beyond those challenges, right, it's this horrific burden of symptoms. The other thing is what we call dysautonomia. So the small fibers that innervate the skin, they also innervate our organs to mediate the automatic processes of our body. None of us think of when to breathe. None of us are controlling our heart rates or our blood pressures or our blinking, right? Those are all automatic. Or we don't think about propelling food from our stomach to our intestines and down, right? Those are all automatic processes, and many of them are disordered. So you have these patients who are sitting there with resting heart rates of 110, athletes. That's the other horrible thing about my patient population. The majority, I would say 70%, I'll take these histories, and they're like literally, when I take a history, I start with my patients, I take a lot of time, I go very linearly, and I say, this is what I want to hear. I want to hear you tell me what you were like, what happened, COVID, and what you're like now. And when we go to their pre-morbid or pre-COVID histories, over and over and over again, I have my patients tell me, I was doing great. I took care of myself. I worked out 3-5 times a week. I ate well. I played with my family. We went on trips. I was working hard. I was doing well at my career. And they're sitting, I do telehealth, and they're sitting, across the screen from me, and they're just decimated because all of that disappeared. And now they're this chronically ill person in society that no one's really helping. And so the sadness is really almost indescribable. So, with this dysautonomia, I think that really produces a lot of the fatigue, a lot of the other symptoms, the disordered circulation. I mean, we need blood flow to all of our cells, all of our bodies, in order to deliver oxygen and remove carbon dioxide so the cells can work normally. And that basic function is not occurring when you have this much dysregulation in the body that's caused by this spike protein. Then I kind of separate out cranial symptoms. So I see these just horrendous headaches that patients have, ringing in the ears, vertigo, where they're constantly dizzy, mild to moderate to severe vision loss, hearing losses, and so there's a lot of cranial abnormalities that I see. One of my colleagues later will talk about it. He's an expert at dealing with cranial pathology. He's a craniosacral osteopath, and he has a lot of good approaches. And he's a good colleague of mine, and I've learned a lot from him, and he's someone I actually reach out to and refer patients to when I'm struggling at mitigating their symptoms. And then I talked about the cognition, and then there's a whole bunch of others. Like I said, the GI system is oftentimes wrecked. People can't tolerate food, their bowel movements are disordered, they always feel uncomfortable or bloated, the intestines aren't working, lots of musculoskeletal joint pains, muscle pains, stiffness. And by the way, I skipped the motor neuropathies. Those are kind of the worst. So the sensory is one, and then I have others that have uncontrolled motor movement. So fasciculations, where you can see like the muscle contract, and they're not even moving their hand, they're just looking at their arm, and they'll send me videos, and I can see the muscle is contracting. That's not in your head. Right? I didn't make that point before, but when the doctor sees all of those normal tests and the patient's sitting there alive but reporting all these crazy symptoms, what's the diagnosis? They're crazy, right? Psychiatry. And that's literally what they do. A significant portion of my patients, they've journeyed through the system, invariably been told, you need to see a therapist, a psychiatrist, do some exercise, I don't even know what they tell them, but very little treatments are offered because now the system doesn't offer treatments until large double-blind, multi-center, heavily funded, pharma-controlled, randomized controlled trials are done to tell them what to do, right? And so there's no really attempts at treatment. And this perversion of the Hippocratic Oath, this do no harm nonsense, which I've seen perverted since the beginning of COVID, right? Which is, the way it's interpreted in COVID is do nothing because you might hurt someone. That's not what Hippocrates said. You have to do something, but always with the intent of doing no harm, but it doesn't mean do nothing. And yet now we have this modern stance, which is that if you don't have a randomized controlled trial to tell you that it's works and that it's safe, then doing something, you have a higher risk of hurting. That's nonsense. We can use our judgment. We have many therapies that we've learned about for decades. We know their safety profiles. We know how they work. It's totally reasonable to try therapies, and that's literally the mainstay of how I approach treatment, which I'll talk about in a second. But anyway, and then obviously menstrual problems. I see a lot of new allergies, hypersensitivities, temperature dysregulation. They're hot when it's cold out. They're cold when it's hot out. Night sweats. Literally the body is completely disordered. It's like a virus software where the computer's not working. I'll be very brief here. How many physicians in the crowd? One, not many. Okay, so I'm not going to go too geeky on the sciences. I'm just going to leave this list for you guys to look at. This is what we know from the immunologic sort of clinical literature of the processes. And I'll just summarize that the vast majority are really a dysregulated immune system, autoimmunity, as well as clotting. And probably the most important is the mitochondrial either shutdown or dysfunction, which is the mitochondria are the energy-forming units of each cell. It's what keeps each cell alive, its membrane intact, and its functions going. And when you lose the energy powerhouse, when it shuts down, your cells can't do what they're designed and what they need to do for you to function fully. And that's a large part of what I see is why these patients are so disabled. Their little energy producing centers of the cells have shut down or are dysregulated. And so that's what causes this great burden of symptoms. My approach to treatment, so again, baseline lab testing, a lot of my patients, they're coming to me from Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic. They've been to all these centers, tons of tests, nothing really actionable, no treatments offered. And so I don't actually do a lot of testing. If I see someone de novo, I might do some standard basic testing. Very rarely that I find something actionable. The reactivated virus thing I'm still not convinced of that. I'm kind of an outlier in the reactivated virus kind of discussion. Because I do see when you do lab testing evidence of reactivated viruses, but I don't know that it contributes to a lot of the symptoms. I think it's an epiphenomenon, and I think it's just an outgrowth of a dysregulated immune system. I think if you go to the root of the disease and start to correct some of those immune dysregulations, that'll take care of the reactivated virus. Because I've tried to treat the viruses specifically, and I haven't seen a lot of clinical improvements. That's just my personal clinical belief. The other problem, and this is the thing, so I'm going to talk to you about how I treat, but I want to be clear, I put in a disclaimer, this is how I treat. There are many doctors out there who are trying to treat this. They have different backgrounds, training, experiences, wisdom, preferences for risk tolerance, aggressiveness, and so there's a lot of things that will inform how an individual physician will approach treatment. Mine is my own career, my own background, my own training is my own. It doesn't mean it's that I'm doing the best at it. I'm sure there's others who have figured out more things than I have. All I can tell you is I've been doing it a lot, and I've been focusing on it a lot, and I'm learning a lot, and I'm trying a lot. It's probably what puts me ahead of most, is that I've tried a lot of different things in somewhat systematic fashions. And so what I do in my protocols have kind of evolved and been built up over the last year and a half. I've kind of abandoned certain strategies that I thought were really important in the beginning, and I've sort of added on things through testimonials and collaborations with a network of colleagues, and I'm learning a lot from colleagues. And you know, it's almost like old gumshoe medicine. This is how medicine started, by observation, empiricism, trialing things, discovering by responses to therapy what might be wrong with someone, and really collaboration and sharing with colleagues. And it's almost like we're doing that in the underground, because you can't really publish papers about the extent and the severity of these syndromes that's politically incorrect in the medical journals, because they're safe and effective still. Now, you'll see papers break through in second and third tier journals, even first tier journals, which are really call into question the vaccines, but they're kind of few and far between. But I do really actually like the freedom and autonomy and discussions with colleagues. I'm learning a lot. Many have become mentors to me, and I think I share my own experiences, and it's been very rich. But to juxtapose that with actually what the system is doing to research this disease, a few weeks ago, two articles were published in major magazines where they described the current state of research into long COVID in the United States. $1.2 billion has been committed to long COVID research. To date, 5 clinical trials have been designed to test various therapeutics. Only one is ready to enroll a patient, and they haven't enrolled a patient yet. And that first trial is studying Paxlovid, which is one of the most clearest demonstrations of the system that we're living in. The science of using Paxlovid for long COVID is so farcical and absurd, that's a whole discussion. But the fact that they would choose a pricey, patented pharmaceutical product as the first thing they want to study tells you everything about the system of medicine that we practice in. So we're not getting help. We're not getting therapeutics research. But I'll tell you, I would say on our low budgets, in our busy times, those of us in practices who are overwhelmed with these patients, we're figuring stuff out, and we are definitely helping people. I will tell you, every patient that sees me gets better to some extent. I've cured very few, and I wouldn't even call them cures, but I would say of the 600, let's call it 600 me and my partner have, I would say we have 10 or 15 patients that are back to normal activities off of all medicines. We have another significant proportion who are nearly back to baseline, but they still require a lot of ongoing therapy. And then there are, on the other end of the spectrum, I have some that I'm really struggling to help, minimally, if at all. Some patients, another aspect of the disease is some of them are extremely medication sensitive. This dysregulated body that they're in, when you interrupt whatever that disordered balance they're in, they tend to feel worse, even though you're doing it to hopefully make them feel better. And so there's a few that are really, really difficult to treat. So anyway, the other part of me is not only my training, my background, but I'm an ICU doctor. Man, I took care of the acutely dying, life-threatening illnesses. Like, I'm really aggressive. You had to be. And so I'm like kind of a guy who uses and is a bias to more potent therapies. I like therapies where I can clinically discern their effects. Stuff that takes months to work, I'm just like an impatient guy. I can't put someone on a supplement and say, I'll see you in 4 months, and then they come back and tell me that their suffering has been unchanged at all. I have a large group of nurses. We follow up regularly. I have my patients update me, and I do these sequential trials of therapy. And so I do use a fair amount of pharmaceuticals, but I have a very broad range of therapeutics. And that's the other beautiful thing, is having left the system as a critical care doctor, now I'm learning how to be an expert at complex chronic illness, which is very, very different than critical care. But I still bring some of my critical care traits to it. And I actually think the patients appreciate that, because many of them are just so happy that I'm willing to try stuff to really make them feel better. Because most of this, if they've ever been given a therapy in their journey, it'll be something like gabapentin, which is like a little nerve pain agent, or maybe a muscle relaxant in some cases, but really very little. What else did I want to say there? Also, my understanding of the underpinnings and roots of complex or chronic illness has been recently kind of transformed, and I'm learning new paradigms and understandings of complex illness. This is not a disease that I've studied before, but I am trying to study it. And I want to point people to a Substack written by someone who writes under the name of Midwestern Doctor. Their Substack is called The Forgotten Side of Medicine. They're deeply studied on not only the history of medicine, many of the mechanisms of disease that have kind of been discovered and disbanded. And there's this thing called the cell danger response. I'm just going to refer you to that for those of you who are geeky or into science, because it's pretty dense. But for me, it's been transformative, and I've been thinking a lot about it over the last few days. He just posted those. They just posted those a few days ago. The other challenge I have is that my patients also come with their own idiosyncrasies, whether it be financial barriers. Some of the therapies that I'll recommend that they pursue are expensive. Cash, out of pocket. Insurances don't cover them, right? Because the system's captured. The cheap, easy stuff, or the stuff that they can't make a lot of money off of, are generally not covered by insurance, and so financial barriers exist. Geographical barriers exist. I have patients who live rurally. They can't go to cities where some of these centers like hyperbaric or ozone or some of these clinic-based therapies are available, and so sometimes I'm limited in what I can do for individual patients. So it becomes complex on both sides. Okay, so this is my practice, drpierrekory.com. One last thing I'll say is, because I think people like hearing this, but with this capture of the system and the persecution of doctors like myself, luckily, we've all talked about this concept of building parallel systems. And one system that I discovered was that the Crow Indian tribe out of Montana created this construct called the First Nations Medical Board, and I now practice under their jurisdiction. I became a registered tribal practitioner of the Crow Indian tribe. I see a hand up in the air there. Yeah. And, the legal construct is that as long as my patient is a Crow Indian tribe member, and you can sign up, all my patients have to become members, registered members. It's $35 a year. And once they're a tribal member and I'm a tribal practitioner, that relationship is protected at a federal statute level under the jurisdiction of the Crow Indian tribe. So any state wants to come after me for anything, you can go to the First Nations Medical Board. The state of Wisconsin, New York, California, where I'm licensed, they have no jurisdiction over my practice anymore because I'm not treating a U.S. citizen. I'm treating a tribal patient. But I had to do that. They're going to shut me down. They're after me. I have numerous complaints at my medical board, never from a patient, always from well-meaning pharmacists and physicians, right? My favorite line of all the complaints was, his license should be revoked because he brings disrepute to the physicians of Wisconsin. And I read that, I'm like, wow, me? What did I do? Right? But you get it. They go after you. Anyway, so I mentioned before, because we don't have really good research, there's very few trials. In fact, there's one trial of hyperbaric oxygen which was positive in long COVID, and there's kind of a couple of weaker trials on some microbiome interventions, but there's really not a lot of trials. And so, it's hard, there's so many different things that are purportedly effective, that have good mechanisms on paper, that I hear testimonials on. It's actually dizzying. I can't practice medicine with 100 different approaches to the same disease. So that's why I evolve, and I gently will integrate things slowly, try things out, talk to other physicians, check the mechanisms. But when I do something, so what I have to do, the other point I want to make about all the testing doesn't tell me what treatment to start in any individual patient, nor does how they present. And that's the odd thing, that every organ only has a limited number of symptoms it can present to you. So the underlying mechanism, which is rendering that organ dysfunctional, can present in very similar ways with different underlying causes. And so it's hard to tell from symptoms what that main underlying mechanism is. If you remember that slide I went through briefly, I kind of put down 6 mechanisms. My treatments are actually things that I have pharmacological mechanisms of action which counteract those underlying pathologic processes. The problem is I don't have tests to tell me which is the predominant pathological process. And in my experience over the last year and a half, many patients respond to treatment A, which works on pathologic process A, B, C, D. I see these iterative improvements with subsequent therapies. And so some of my patients are on numerous different agents or compounds to get them better. But when they're on them, and if I keep them on them, it's because it worked. And some of the patients, they know what worked. They can tell me what worked, and they know it works either on the front end or on the back end. When they run out, they don't refill something, they start to deteriorate. So they know how important these compounds are. But when I introduce them, because they're empiric, I don't really know exactly what they're going to benefit from, because I've had too many experiences where I see patient A and B, they present identically, and yet compound A and B works great in the first one. And I made a mistake early on in my overconfidence. I'd be like, I know exactly what you need to the second. I saw someone like you last week. They did great on this and this. And then I try it. Nothing. doesn't work at all. And so even my clinical pattern recognition skills, which is actually what makes an expert, definition of expert for me, it's not your knowledge base, it's your ability to recognize patterns. And this disease is so complex, so idiosyncratic, it presents similarly with very different underlying root causes that it's constantly humbling me. So I've learned to be quite humble with my predictions on how I'm going to get someone better, but I keep trying. So I do sequential trials of therapy. I separate out them by time so each patient can serve as their own control, because if I can determine that something didn't work, we get rid of it. If I know something worked, then we'll keep it. Also, when I know something works, it's somewhat of a diagnostic test. So when I do a therapeutic trial and it works, it gives me an idea of what that underlying mechanism is, because I know how that medicine works. And so if it helped, I know I can guess what was going wrong underneath. Okay, so my theories are largely mechanistic. I start with basic, simple stuff. And when I sort of made that derogatory comment of these long COVID centers telling my patients to go to physical therapy and do light exercise, it's absolutely absurd. These patients cannot tolerate exercise and should not. In fact, in a survey from React-19, which is a vaccine injury organization, they did this sort of big survey, and it was a therapeutic survey. They just asked all these vaccine injured, what have you tried, what's helped you? And there's all over the board. It's not actually the greatest survey in terms of data, but what was interesting is the number one rated treatment for all vaccine injured with this syndrome was pacing. It was actually moderating or modulating activity so that they would feel better. And so most of my patients know that by the time they see me. Others don't. I have to counsel them. I use something called a spoons method, where you kind of assign a spoon to a unit of activity. So emptying the dishwasher is one spoon, driving the kids to school is another, maybe making a meal is a third, making your bed. For some, they can't even do a half a spoon a day. But you get to know how many spoons a day. So like I've had patients who've come to find out, like, I can clean the house in the morning and I can make a meal that night, but I can't do anything else. If I try to go further and do laundry, I'm dead for 2 days. They're in bed for 2 days. So I try to tell them, find your limit, stay under it. I actually think it makes them worse when they exceed it. And then there's this other psychological problem that I run into with my patients, where some refuse to obey that limit. And the reason why is because they're stuck in their houses, they're on their couches, they're non-functional, they're socially isolated, they can't go out to see friends or go to restaurants because they have to pay for it. They can't go to their kid's ball game in the sun because they're going to be in bed for 3 days. But they do it anyway. Why would they want to make themselves sick? Because they're sick and tired of being in the house. And so I can't blame them. I get it. Every once in a while, you got to live a little, right? And so, but the problem is every time they live a little, they pay for it. So that's some of the basics I do. And then rest, sleep. I counsel them on sleep. Luckily, I've had an unheralded record of excellent sleep behaviors for like 3 decades now. So I'm kind of the world expert. In bed by 10, up at 7, every day, never varying, always restful. That was a joke, guys. Nobody's laughing. Are you kidding me? I'm like the worst sleeper in the world. I'm insane out of my mind, but luckily I'm not sick. That's probably what makes me sick. So if I could figure that out, I'd be even more better. And then my diet. Wait to hear about my diet. So for instance, I woke up this morning and I had organic blueberries, as I do every morning. There, cue the laughter. I actually did have organic blueberries this morning. But that's like the first time in 5 years that's how I started my day. So anyway, you guys get it. But for them, it's really critical that they try to, really pay attention to sleep, good sleep practices, particularly food, processed foods, high fructose corn syrup, processed, things out of a box or a bag. I try to eat food that looks like food and clean food. And so, with some, it's more successful than others. But you got to start somewhere. And then let's go to therapeutics. So for me, 1 second. How much time do I have, Bruce? Okay, I can just keep going. Keep going till you pull me off the stage.
40 minutes now.
At 40?
40 now.
Oh boy. All right, we'll go a little quicker. Shocker, I start everyone on ivermectin. Just briefly, the way I think ivermectins work, ivermectin has about 20 beneficial mechanisms of action. The ones that we rely on for prevention, for early treatment, are very different than the ones that I believe are operative in long COVID. It's called the wonder drug for a reason, because it's pretty much, in my estimation, it's the safest drug product that probably in history. It's safer than aspirin, it's safer than Tylenol. It's given out across the world in billions of doses without doctors, with distribution programs. It's really a very well-tolerated drug, and it has so many different effects. It's anti-parasite, antiviral, anti-tumor, and anti-inflammatory. And not only on paper does it make sense, but in my practice, it's the medicine that brings about the most frequent response. And I would say about 70% of my practice are ivermectin responders. Now, those responses vary from modest to sometimes really large and enormous restorative. But the 30% that don't respond is a problem, because my ivermectin non-responders, I know the road ahead is going to be longer and harder, and the achievements are going to be smaller. There's just something fundamentally different about my ivermectin responders. How do I dose it? This is mine. I've seen many people have come to me that might have tried ivermectin and said, we're giving it 3 times a week for a month and then stopped. I don't even know what some people are doing, but this is what I do. I do daily ivermectin. I do 0.3 milligrams per kilogram per actual body weight, which is a reasonably high dose. It's sort of moderate dose. And when I see a response, I put everyone on a trial of double dose, because when I do that and I kind of up the dose even more, in about 40-50% I see a dose-response relationship. So I'll say to patients like, wow, Dr. Kory, the higher dose even improved me more. Others will be like, I doubled the dose and nothing really changed, and I put them back to the regular dose. But that's how I dose ivermectin, and they stay on it. I have gotten a few people off, but once it works and it's working, it becomes a chronic maintenance med. They take it every day. I have some patients in my practice who have now been on it for 2 years. Those who came to me already knowing that ivermectin was helpful for them. And they get sick if they forget to refill their medicine or run out. In fact, I had a patient last week who had an apartment fire and lost her medicines, and she was in a place she couldn't get access, and she actually really relapsed, was very sick. She was one of those people with a lot of motor abnormalities, tremors and convulsions, and she was super sick. I call an emergency benzodiazepines, which I don't really like to do, but that actually really helps her, and she was really in distress. So you can see how important the medicine is. Another one, another my mainstay is low-dose naltrexone, which has a lot of anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties. It's used in a number of chronic diseases for decades. It's really helpful in this syndrome. I've had patients have tremendous responses, sometimes more modest. I would say maybe 60% of my patients respond to that. This one's a little trickier than ivermectin. It's not always well tolerated, especially in what I see in older females over above 50. Sometimes they can have a rough time with it. So I start real slow. I use a dilution. I use liquid, so they take a drop a night, and every 5 nights I increase. So I start low and go real slow with low-dose naltrexone. It actually affects circadian rhythms and sleep, and so I tell my patients, if ever you hit a dose where in the morning you feel a sense of refreshed sleep, stop. That's your dose. If you develop insomnia or nausea or dizziness or constipation, drop it by half, and then we'll increase later, 2 weeks later. Because you can find that if you drop it by half, some of the side effects will go away, and then you're able to increase after. So it's kind of a tricky, not tricky, but it has some nuances on how to use it effectively. So that's kind of my other mainstay. Autophagy fasting, for those who can tolerate. I really like intermittent fasting. We know it induces this process which breaks down diseased and dead tissue, and we believe it helps remove the spike burden from the body. If my patients can, I will try to have them do more prolonged water fast as tolerated. Not everyone can tolerate fasting, but those that can, I've had significant benefits reported in some. And then we use something called nattokinase, which is a natural soybean-derived enzyme. It's kind of a staple of the Japanese diet, and the Japanese are known for being those who enjoy some of the longest longevity in the world, as well as one of the lowest incidences of cardiovascular disease. So nattokinase, just for everyone, is really a good supplement. In fact, I'm on it now just because I think it's good for long-term health, but it seems to be particularly helpful in these patients who are sick because it breaks down spike protein. It also breaks down fibrin, which is one of the clotting proteins that we see developing in the blood. So nattokinase is really helpful. Hydroxychloroquine we use more for the autoimmune component. Hydroxychloroquine probably takes longer to work, so it's kind of that's a drug that I don't see like generally short-term, immediately clinical discernible responses, but I do think it's important for their dysregulated immune system over the long term. So I kind of put that as a floor, and they take that chronically throughout their illness. The newest kind of kid to the block on my first line stuff, and by the way, I just ran through 5 or 6 different therapies. Though I call them first line, but again, I separate out them by time. In my notes, I'll say, start this, wait 10 days, update me, we'll discuss it, then I'll have you move on to this. But I kind of run them through this in over 4 to 6 weeks, these first kind of few compounds and interventions. This quantum NAC is a kind of a fascinating story. So N-acetylcysteine is a very common supplement that people take. It's an antioxidant, it's anti-inflammatory. A lot of people take it just for general health. Many of my patients with long COVID and vaccine injury are on it. When I first started in practice, I was kind of putting everyone on it because everyone said that this is really important. I never really saw a clinical benefit that I could attribute to NAC. And then there was this group in Italy, they called themselves Zero Spike. It's a nonprofit group, and they had this kind of, as I wrote up here, an intuition to try to change the formulation of N-acetylcysteine to one that's more molecularly coherent, so a more homogeneous structure. And they found that in cell culture studies that this kind of new formulation of NAC really broke down spike protein. Like 96% of the spike protein in the cell culture model was degraded versus 4% with regular NAC. And the reason I discovered it is I was getting testimonials from colleagues and from patients who had tried it. Thousands of people in Europe were on it. So me and my partner started integrating it. We were pretty impressed. Like we started putting patients on it. We were seeing pretty reproducible, very positive benefits to it. I don't know if it's on the slide. See the last line? Look, there's my finger. You have to go here. That's the one distributor in the U.S. It's vitahealthapothecary.com. Otherwise, you can order from Ility, but they generally have a supply there. So anyway, I use that a lot. And then after kind of that first line, I generally reassess, I'll visit them, and then I'll do at least a 2-week trial of what we call mast cell suppression. So mast cells are allergic cells. The spike protein triggers them. They can cause an innumerable array of symptoms that are not allergic, brain fog, fatigue, weird. It's not just rashes and itching or swelling. It can actually cause organ dysfunction in any number of, and in quite a few of my patients, when I suppress the effects of histamine with antihistamines or I use a mast cell stabilizer, they will improve. And so my protocol for that, yeah, you'll see it. I do kind of high-dose Claritin, loratadine, 20 milligrams BID. Famotidine, which is Pepsid, I'll do that. That's also an H1 or H2 blocking agent. And then ketotifen, which is a stabilizer. So that's kind of my mast cell. If that doesn't produce effects, I get rid of it. I also put them on low histamine diets. I also give them a DAO enzyme, which breaks down histamine that liberated from food. And then, so that's kind of a second step. And then comes anticoagulation, which to me has been one of the most effective in mitigating symptoms. This microclotting phenomenon that we're seeing, and actually I was talking to a gentleman earlier who's learning and been doing live blood analysis, which is a test where you take fresh blood, you put it on a slide, and you can see some of the cellular function and aggregation. And what we're seeing is a lot of platelet activation, red cell clumping, even fibrin forming, which is a clotting protein. And so you have kind of this sludged blood, which leads to poor microcirculatory delivery of gases. So as those cells that are clumped are trying to go to the tiniest of vessels, they don't flow through very well. And so you have disordered perfusion to all of the important tissues and organs, and that causes a lot of symptoms. And we see pretty dramatic responses to anticoagulation. The other thing I should say about this strategy, of everything that I do with repurpose, I generally am very cognizant of their safety profiles. This is the one that has a purported risk, right? So you have people that are on triple therapy. This is what we call it in medicine. So when you're on aspirin, Plavix, and Eliquis, which is an anticoagulant, those are 2 platelet blocking agents and one that's a clot forming inhibitor. And the risks of people bleeding when you're on that triple therapy traditionally in other diseases has been, I wouldn't say high, but considerable, where you are worried about spontaneous bleeds, especially as we get older. Most of the risks are in older folks. Luckily, most of my patients are generally young, I would say under 60 that come to me. So I think their risks are low. Our experience now from different groups around the world that are using aggressive anticoagulation, very, very few spontaneous bleeds. And I think there are good reasons for that. Number one is that these patients are hypercoagulable. Yeah, I'm almost done. I got a couple, maybe one more slide. These patients are hypercoagulable. So it's not like you're taking someone with normal coagulation who has a risk of a clot and then making them hypocoagulable. I think you're bringing them more towards normal. And I think that's why we don't see a lot of spontaneous bleeds. The other safety sort of approach around this is that it generally when it works, it brings about fairly robust responses quickly, usually within days to a week. So if I have someone who's 2 weeks out on this triple therapy and they can't relate that there's been a significant improvement, I just stop it. So I'm not going to put someone for long term on triple therapy if I don't think it's bringing about a benefit. Those for whom it brings about a benefit, they don't want me to stop it. They have concerns about being on it, but they know how important it's been to relieving and mitigating their symptoms. And then I'm just going to go, and this is just some slides. I also do, I give some supplements which support the formation of nitric oxide, because the nitric oxide synthesis and activity pathways, that's a gas that regulates vasoconstriction, dilation, and affects circulation. And I see pretty good improvements from focusing on that. And then, comes the more severe cases, either single organ problems that I find that are kind of refractory to my treatments, or I've run them through the paces, gone through my trials, and they just haven't significantly got better. I'm learning different strategies and referrals to send people to. Again, after Dr. Seneff, you're going to hear from my colleague who's a craniosacral osteopath. He's been really great for actually even problems outside the cranium that originate outside the cranium. He has very different approaches to disease, but he's really a bedside physician. He does manipulations and assessments, and I do telehealth. So I'm kind of somewhat limited in my powers. But one thing you can say about me and my partner is that we're scalable. We can see patients everywhere. But for the more stickier cases, I'll send them to a craniosacral osteopath or to some of these more aggressive clinic-based systemic therapies, like the combinations like ozone, methylene blue, near-infrared light, hyperbaric oxygen, IV vitamin C, ultraviolet blood irradiation. And there's a few programs that have done pretty well by some of my patients, meaning brought them from like 20% functioning to 70, not 100, not in my experience in those that I've sent, but the patients are extremely happy. So I'm happy when they come back to me happy because they really have had their lives somewhat transformed. But I'm still a little kind of disappointed because when I take a careful history after they've gone through these treatments, there's still significant deficits that they're living with, especially those exertional deficits. They still have to be careful, but a lot of their suffering has been reduced. And then there's newer stuff that I've been trying. So other things, adaptogens, like an old Chinese herbal, ashwagandha. I use that for stress response. I'm very interested in the therapies of high-dose vitamin D. That's actually been working in some of my patients. These are more recent kind of adoptions. And then peptides, which is a whole other topic. And then, you're not going to talk about exosomes. Well, I won't talk about exosomes either because I'm going to be done here. But these are a bit more expensive, clinic-based, but myself and my partner, we're starting to use combinations of exosomes and stem cells, and we're seeing pretty significant improvements with that. That seems to be a really important and potent approach to reversing some of the underlying root causes of this illness. Problem there is money. But luckily, there's some shining lights there. There's a couple of nonprofits that have popped up that are now raising money to get funds for some of my patients who can't afford it so they can get these more advanced therapies. And so I'm just going to finish up there. I think I went too long, but hopefully you guys learned something about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to help these patients.